Hey guys, Mr. Ryan here. So go for the rest of the quarantine for the until June 12th. I want to read holes with some supplemental articles, just to have some momentum going, kind of like we did with the uh, essays. So these videos will be me reading the chapters that I have assigned for that day or so. Um, So I'm gonna be. I have the book up here, so I'll be reading from the computer. And joining us is a special guest teacher. This is Callie. She doesn't like books, and she's not very helpful, but she'll be here to help us read. Okay, so we're reading Holes. The PDF will be on all of the assignment pages. Um, so if you want to follow along, or if you don't want to hear me read, you can stop this video now, say bye to Callie, and just read the chapters assigned for yourself. Okay, so I'm going to read 1 through 7 right now. Okay, and Callie's going to help me out as well. All right? Okay. So, part 1. You are entering Camp Green Lake. There's no lake at Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago. Now it's just a dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a... All right, fine. You don't have to... Bye. There used to be... No. There used to be a town of Green Lake as well. The town... No, don't bite that either. The town shriveled and dried up along with the lake and the people who lived there. During the summer time... You're going to have to read it with me. During the summer, daytime temperature hovers around 95 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade. There's not much shade in a big, dry lake. Right? I know. There are only trees. Go away. There are only trees and the only trees are 2 old oaks on the eastern edge of the lake. A hammock is stretched between the 2 trees, and a log cabin stands behind that. The campers are forbidden to be in the hammock. It belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under rocks in the holes dug by the campers. Here's a good rule to remember about rattlesnakes and scorpions. If you don't bother them, they won't bother you, usually. Being bitten by a scorpion or even a rattlesnake is not the worst thing that can happen to you. You won't die, usually. Sometimes a camper will try to get bitten by a scorpion or even a small rattlesnake. Then he will spend a day or 2 recovering in his tent instead of having to dig a hole out on the lake. But you don't want to be bitten by a yellow-spotted lizard. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. You will die a slow and painful death, always. If you get bitten by a yellow-spotted lizard, you might as well go to the shade of the oak trees and lie in the hammock. There's nothing anyone can do to you anymore. Chapter 2. The reader's probably asking, why would anyone want to go to Camp Green Lake? Most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. If you take a bad boy and make him dig holes every day in the hot sun, it will turn him into a good boy. That was what some people thought. Stanley Yellnuts was given a choice. The judge said, you may go to jail or you may go to Camp Green Lake. Stanley was from a poor family, and he had never been to camp before. Chapter 3. Stanley Yellnuts was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver, with the bus seat turned around facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting 10 rows back, handcuffed to the armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained a toothbrush, toothpaste, and a box of stationery his mother had given him. He'd promised to write her at least once a week. He looked out the window. Although there wasn't much to see, mostly fields of hay and cotton, he was on a long bus ride to nowhere. There wasn't the bus wasn't air conditioned, and the hot, heavy air was almost as stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents tried to pretend that he was just going away to camp for a while, just like rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend the animals were at camp. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have them play soccer with a marble. Other times, where you go? You trying to get off? There you go. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have them play soccer with marble. Other times they'd run obstacle course or go bungee jumping off a table, tied to broken rubber bands. Now Stanley tried to pretend he was going to Camp Fun and Games. Maybe out of there. 1 second. All right, back to it. Maybe he'd make some friends, he thought. At least he'd try to swim in the lake. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight, and the kids at the middle school often teased him about his size. Even the teachers sometimes made cruel comments without realizing it. On his last day of school, his math teacher, Mrs. Belt, what are you eating? No. Mrs. Belt taught ratios. Kind of a weird thing to teach on the last day of school, but whatever. As an example, she chose the heaviest kid in class and the lightest kid in class, and had them weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boy. Miss Bell wrote the ratio on the board, 3-1, unaware of how much embarrassment she had caused both of them. I mean, she should have known. That's probably not a good way to teach. Stanley was arrested later that day. What do you need? He looked at the guard, who sat slumped in his seat, and wondered if he had fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. He had just been at the wrong place at the wrong time. Stop biting it. It was all because of his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whenever anything went wrong, they always blamed Stanley's no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who stole a pig from a one-legged gypsy, and she had put a curse on him and all of his descendants. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course, but whenever anything went wrong, it felt good to be able to blame someone. Things went wrong a lot. They always seemed to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked out the window at the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and fall of a telephone wire. In his mind, he could hear his father's gruff voice softly singing to him, if only the woodpecker cried. The bark on the tree was a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely. He cries to the moon, if only, if only. It was a song his father had used to sing to him. The melody was sweet and sad, but Stanley's favorite part was when his father would howl the word moon. The bus hit a small bump. The guard sat up, instantly alert. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you need 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart and had a lot of perseverance. Once he had started a project, he would work at it for years, often going days without sleep. He had never get out of here, dude. He would never have any bit of luck. You're going in the crate. 1 second. All right, you're going in the crate. 1 second. All right. Anyways. Stanley's father was smart and had a lot of perseverance. Every time an experiment failed, Stanley would hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Stanley's father was also named Stanley Yelnuts. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yelnuts III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yelnuts IV. Everyone in his family always liked the fact that Stanley Yelnuts was spelled the same way forward as and backward, so they kept naming their son Stanley. Stanley was an only child, as was every other Stanley Yelnuts before him. All of them had something else in common. Despite their awful luck, they always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father liked to say, I learned from failure. But perhaps that was part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it wouldn't hurt so much every time their hopes were crushed. Not every Stanley Yelnuts has been a failure, Stanley's mother often pointed out whenever Stanley or his father became so discouraged that they actually started to believe in the curse. The first Stanley Yelnuts, Stanley's great-grandfather, had made a fortune in the stock market. He couldn't have been too unlucky. At such times, she often neglected to mention the bad luck that befell the first Stanley Yelnuts. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by the outlaw, Kissin' Kate Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would now be living in a mansion on the beach in California. Instead, they were crammed into a tiny apartment that smelled of burning rubber and foot odor. If only. The apartment smelled the way it did because Stanley's father was trying to invent a new way to recycle old sneakers. The first person who finds a use for old sneakers, he said, will be a very rich man. It was the latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Notice how the author, this is just a break, notice how the author weaves in the background of Stanley's life along the bus ride. Like the whole time he's on this bus, but it keeps drawing back into his family history. It's a really good storytelling technique, one that we can't master yet in 6th grade. It's beyond me, but it's you can appreciate it. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when he found out that his great-grandfather had been robbed by Kissin' Kate Barlow. True, he would have preferred to be living on a beach in California, but it was still kind of cool to have someone in your family robbed by a famous outlaw. Kate Barlow didn't actually kiss Stanley's great-grandfather. That would have been really cool, but she only kissed the men she killed. Instead, she robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of the desert. Kind of worse, almost. Didn't really give him much hope, but he survived. He was lucky to have survived. Spoiler. Stanley's mother was quick to point out. The bus was slowing down. The guard grunted and stretched his arms. Welcome to Camp Green Lake, said the driver. Stanley looked out the dirty window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. Chapter 4. Stanley felt somewhat dazed as the guard unlocked his handcuffs and let him off the bus. He had been on the bus for over 8 hours. Be careful, the bus driver said as Stanley walked down the steps. Stanley wasn't sure if the bus driver meant for him to be careful going down the steps or if he was telling him to be careful at Camp Green Lake. Thanks for the ride, he said. His mouth was dry and his throat hurt. He stepped onto the hard, dry dirt. There was a band of sweat around his wrist where the handcuffs had been. The land was barren and desolate. He could see a few run-down buildings and some tents. Farther away, there was a cabin beneath 2 tall trees. Those 2 trees were the only plant life he could see. There weren't even weeds. So that's a really small paragraph, but he does, Louis Sekar, does a really good job of just painting a picture with pretty easy words. You guys are capable of doing that and have done that in your elaborate detail. The guard led Stanley to a small building. A sign on the front said, "You are entering Camp Green Lake Juvenile Correctional Facility." Next to it, another sign which declared that it was a violation of Texas Penal Code to bring guns, explosives, weapons, drugs, or alcohol onto the premises. As Stanley read the sign, he couldn't help but think, well, duh. The guard led Stanley into the building, where he felt the welcome relief of air conditioning. A man was sitting with his feet up on the desk. He turned his head when Stanley and the guard entered, but otherwise didn't move. Even though was inside, he wore sunglasses and a cowboy hat. He also held a can of soda, and the sight of it made Stanley even more aware of his own thirst. He waited while the bus guard gave the man some papers to sign. "That's a lot of sunflower seeds," the bus guard said. Stanley noticed a burlap sack filled with sunflower seeds on the floor next to the desk. "I quit smoking last month." This is my Mr. Sher accent, said the man in the cowboy hat. He had a tattoo of a rattlesnake on his arm, and he signed his name as he signed his name, the snake's rattle seemed to wiggle. "I used to smoke a pack a day. Now I eat a sack of these every week." The guard laughed. There must have been a small refrigerator behind the desk because the man in the cowboy hat produced 2 more cans of soda. For a second, Stanley hoped that one might be for him, but the man gave one to the guard and said the other was for the driver. 9 hours here, now 9 hours back, the guard grumbled. What a day. Stanley thought about the long, miserable bus ride and felt a little sorry for the guard and bus driver. The man in the cowboy hat spit sunflower seed shells into the paper wastebasket, and then he walked around the desk to Stanley. "My name is Mr. Sir," he said. "Whenever you speak to me, you call me by my name. Is that clear?" Stanley hesitated. Yes, Mr. Sir," he said, though he couldn't imagine that was really the man's name. "You're not in the Girl Scouts anymore," Mr. Sir said. Stanley had to remove his clothes in front of Mr. Sir, who made sure he wasn't hiding anything. He was then given 2 sets of clothes and a towel. Each set consisted of long-sleeve orange jumpsuit, an orange t-shirt, and yellow socks. Stanley wasn't sure if the socks had been yellow originally. Gross. He was also given white sneakers, an orange cap, and a canteen made of heavy plastic, which unfortunately was empty. The cap had a piece of cloth sewn onto the back for neck protection. Stanley got dressed. The clothes smelled like soap. Mr. Sir told him he should wear 1 set to work in and 1 set for relaxation. Laundry was done every 3 days. On the day his work clothes would be washed, the other set would become his work clothes, and he would get clean clothes to wear while resting. "You are to dig 1 hole each day, including Saturdays and Sundays. Each hole must be 5 feet deep and 5 feet across in every direction. Your shovel is your measuring stick. Breakfast is served at 4:30 a.m. Stanley must have looked surprised because Mr. Sir went on to explain that they started early to avoid the hottest part of the day. "No one's going to babysit you," he added. "The longer it takes you to dig, the longer you'll be out in the sun. If you dig up anything interesting, you are to report it to me or any other counselor. When you finish, the rest of the day is yours." Stanley nodded to show that he understood. "This isn't our Girl Scout camp," Mr. Sir said. He checked Stanley's backpack and allowed him to keep it. Then he led Stanley outside into the blazing heat. "Take a good look around you," Mr. Sir said. "What do you see?" Stanley looked around across the wasteland. The air seemed thick with heat and dirt. "Not much," he said. Hastily added, "Mr. Sir." Mr. Sir laughed. "You see any guard towers?" "No." "How about an electric fence?" "No, Mr. Sir." "There ain't no fence at all, is there?" "No, Mr. Sir." "You want to run away?" Mr. Sir asked him. Stanley looked back at him, unsure what he meant. "If you want to run away, go ahead. Start running. I'm not going to stop you." Stanley didn't know what kind of game Mr. Sir was playing. "I see you looking at my gun. Don't worry. I'm not going to shoot you." He tapped his holster. "This is for yellow-spotted lizards. I wouldn't waste a bullet on you." "I'm not going to run away," Stanley said. "Good thinking," said Mr. Sir. "Nobody runs away from here." "We don't need a fence. Know why? Because we got the only water for 100 miles. You want to run away? You'll be buzzard food in 3 days. Stanley could. Some people can hear me read. Stanley could see some people dressed in orange, carrying shovels, dragging toward the tents. "You thirsty?" said Mr. Sir. "Yes, Mr. Sir," Stanley said gratefully. "Well, better get used to it. You're going to be thirsty for the next 18 months. That's a long time to be at this camp. We think this quarantine's bad." Camp Green Lake sounds a lot worse. Chapter 5. There were large gray tents. Each one of them had a black letter on it, A, B, C, D, E, and F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. The counselors slept in F. Stanley was assigned to D tent. Mr. Pendanski was his counselor. "My name is easy to remember," said Mr. Pendanski, as he shook hands with Stanley just outside. 3 easy words: pen, dance, key. Mr. Sir returned to the office. Mr. Pendanski was younger than Mr. Sir, and not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close he was almost bald, but his face was covered in a thick, curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. "Mr. Sir really isn't so bad," said Mr. Pendanski. "He's been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule at Camp Green Lake: don't upset the warden." My Pendanski voice. Stanley nodded, as if he understood. "I want you to know, Stanley, I respect you," Mr. Pendanski said. "I understand you made some mistakes in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Everyone makes mistakes. You have done some bad things, but that doesn't mean you're a bad kid." Stanley nodded. It's pointless to try and tell the counselor that he was innocent. He figured everyone probably said that. He didn't want Mr. Pendanski to think he had a bad attitude. "I'm going to help you turn your life around," said the counselor, "but you're going to have to help, too. Can I count on your help?" "Yes, sir," Stanley said. Mr. Pendanski said, "Good," and patted Stanley on the back. 2 boys, each carrying a shovel, were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendanski called out to them, "Rex, Allen, I want you to say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team." The boys glanced wearily at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat, and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that one kid was white and the other black. "What happened to Barf Bag?" said the black kid. "Oh, Lewis is in the hospital," said Mr. Pendanski. "He won't be returning." He told the boys to come shake Stanley's hand and introduce themselves. "Like gentlemen." "Ah," the white kid grunted. "That's Allen," said Mr. Pendanski. "My name's not Allen," the boy said. "It's Squid. And that's X-Ray." "Hey," said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty, Stanley wondered if he could see out of them. Mr. Pendanski told Allen to go to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. They led them inside the tent. There were seven cots, each one less than 2 feet apart from the one next to it. "Which was Lewis's cot?" Mr. Pendanski asked. "Barf Bag slept here," said X-Ray, kicking one of the beds. "All right, Stanley, that'll be yours." Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He wasn't particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been used by somebody named Barf Bag. 7 crates were stacked in 2 piles at the other side of the tent. The open end of the crates faced outward. Stanley put his backpack and change of clothes and towel in what used to be Barf Bag's crate. It was at the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 other boys. The first 3 were introduced by Mr. Pendanski as Jose, Theodore, and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. "They all have nicknames," explained Mr. Pendanski. "However, I prefer to use the names their parents gave them, the names that society will recognize them by when they return and become useful and hard-working members of society." "It ain't just a nickname," X-Ray told Mr. Pendanski. He tapped his glasses. "I can see inside you, Mom. You got a big fat heart." The last boy entered didn't have a real name, or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Pendanski and X-Ray called him Zero. "You know why his name's Zero?" asked Mr. Pendanski. because there's nothing inside his little head. Should have had my dog over here for that. He smiled playfully and shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. And that's Mom, the boy said. Mr. Pendanski smiled at him. If it makes you feel better to call me Mom, Theodore, go ahead and call me Mom. He turned to Stanley. If you have questions, Theodore, we'll help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm depending on you. Theodore spit a thin line of saliva between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their home sanitary. You're all new here once, said Mr. Pendanski, and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pendanski left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left alone, and he was so thirsty he felt as if he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. Hey, Theodore, he said, going after him, do you know where I can fill my canteen? Theodore whirled and grabbed Stanley by his collar. My name's not Theodore, he said. It's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared up, terrified. There's a water spigot on the wall of the shower stall. Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. As he watched the boy turn and walk away, he couldn't for the life of him figure out why anyone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little bit better about having to sleep on a cot that had been used by somebody named Barfbag. Maybe it was a term of respect. Stanley took a shower, if you could call it that, and ate dinner, if you could call it that, and went to bed, if you could call the smelly and scratchy cot a bed. Because of the scarcity of water, each camper only was allowed a 4-minute shower. It took Stanley nearly that long to get used to the cold water. There was no knob for hot water. He kept stepping into, then jumping back from the spray until the water shot off automatically. He never managed to use his bar of soap, which was just as well, because he wouldn't have had any time to rinse off the suds. Dinner was some kind of stewed meat and vegetables. The meat was brown, and the vegetables had once been green. Everything tasted pretty much the same. He ate it all, and used a slice of white bread to mop up the juice. Stanley had never been one to leave food on his plate, no matter how it tasted. What'd you do? One of the campers asked him. At first, Stanley didn't know what he meant. They sent you here for a reason. Oh, he realized. I stole a pair of sneakers. The other boys thought it was funny. Stanley wasn't sure why. Maybe their crimes had been a lot worse than stealing shoes? From a store? Or were they on somebody's feet? Asked Squid. Neither, Stanley answered. They belonged to Clyde Livingston. Nobody believed them. Sweet feet? Said X-Ray. Yeah, right. No way, said Squid. Now, as Stanley lay on his cot, he thought it was kind of funny in a way. Nobody had believed him when he said he was innocent. Now, when he said he stole them, nobody believed him either. Clyde Sweet Feet Livingston was a famous baseball player. He led the American League in stolen bases over the last 3 years. He was the only player in history to ever hit 4 triples in one game. Stanley had a poster of him hanging on the wall of his bedroom. He used to have the poster anyway. He didn't know where it was now. It had been taken by the police and used it as evidence of his guilt in the locker room. Clyde Livingston came to the court in spite of everything. When Stanley found out that Sweet Feet was going to be there, he was actually excited about the prospect of meeting his hero. Clyde Livingston testified that they were his sneakers and that he donated them to help raise money for the homeless shelter. He couldn't imagine what kind of horrible person would steal from homeless children. That was the worst part about it for Stanley. His hero thought he was no good, dirty, rotten thief. As Stanley tried to turn on his cot, he was afraid it was going to collapse under all his weight. He barely fit in it. When he finally managed to roll over on his stomach, the smell was so bad that he had to turn over again and try sleeping on his back. The cot smelled like sour milk. Though it was night, the air was still very warm. Armpit was snoring 2 cots away. Back at school, a bully named Derek Dunn used to torment Stanley. The teachers never took Stanley's complaint seriously because Derek was so much smaller than Stanley. Some teachers even seemed to find it amusing that a kid like Derek could pick on somebody as big as Stanley. On the day Stanley was arrested, Derek had taken Stanley's textbook after a long game of come and get it and finally dropped it in the toilet in the boys' restroom. By the time Stanley retrieved it, he had missed his bus and had to walk home. He was walking home, carrying his wet notebook, the prospect of having copied down the ruined pages that the sneakers fell from the sky. I was walking home, the sneakers fell from the sky, he told the judge. One hit me on the head. It hurt, too. They hadn't exactly fallen from the sky. He had just walked from underneath a freeway overpass, and when the shoe hit him on the head. Stanley took it as some kind of sign. His father had been trying to figure out a way to recycle old sneakers, and suddenly a pair of sneakers fell on top of him, seemingly out of nowhere, like a gift from God. Naturally, he had no way of knowing they belonged to Clyde Livingston. In fact, the shoes were anything but sweet. Whoever had worn them had a bad case of foot odor. Stanley couldn't help but think there was something special about the shoes, that they would somehow provide the key to his father's invention. It was too much of a coincidence to be a mere accident. Stanley had felt like he was holding Destiny's shoes. He ran. Thinking back now, he wasn't sure why he ran. Maybe he was in a hurry to bring the shoes to his father, or maybe he was trying to run away from his miserable and humiliating day at school. A patrol car pulled alongside him. A policeman asked him why he was running. Then he took the shoes and made a call on his radio. Shortly thereafter, Stanley was arrested. Turns out, the sneakers had been stolen from the display at the homeless shelter. That evening, rich people were going to come to the shelter and pay $100 to eat the food that the poor people ate for free every day for free. Clyde Livingston, who had lived at the shelter when he was younger, was going to speak and sign autographs. His shoes would be auctioned, and it was expected that they would sell for over $5,000. All the money would go to help the homeless. Because of the baseball schedule, Stanley's trial was delayed several months. His parents couldn't afford a lawyer. You don't need a lawyer, his mother said. Just tell the truth. Stanley told the truth, but perhaps it would have been better if he lied a little. He could have said that he found the shoes in the street. Nobody believed they fell from the sky. It wasn't destiny, he realized. It was his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. The judge called Stanley's crime despicable. The shoes were valued at over $5,000. It was the money that would provide food and shelter for the homeless, and you stole that from them, just so you could have a souvenir. The judge said that there was an opening at Camp Green Lake, and he suggested that the discipline of the camp might improve Stanley's character. It was that or jail. Stanley's parents asked if they could have some time to find out more about Camp Green Lake, but the judge advised them to make a decision. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. Alright, we're going to stop there today. So we stopped right before chapter 7, so 1 through 6. Okay, I will have a video up tomorrow as well. Hopefully, Callie can handle being up here and hanging out. She definitely makes the videos better. Okay, so 1 through 6, and then answer the questions, and we'll do 7 through 12 tomorrow. Alright, see you guys.